Welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. Today I am reviewing Sharp Ends. This is a short story collection set in Joe Abercrombie's First Law world. Before I start talking about Sharp Ends though, a little order of business. I would like to thank all of my new subscribers and old. The channel has hit the amazing milestone of 8,000 subscribers. So thank you very much to all of you. It's just, as I've said so many times before, I have enjoyed so much interacting with all of you and learning from you on the channel. This is what I set out to do when I started the channel more than a year ago, and wow, what a journey it's been. So thank you. I was thinking, should I do something special for hitting this milestone? And I was toying with the idea of doing a live stream, but I think what I'm gonna do is wait until, hopefully, if the channel hits 10,000 subscribers. I'm hoping it will. And if it does, I will do a live stream. I'm committing here and now to doing a live stream if the channel hits 10,000 subscribers. And that should be a whole lot of fun. And as you may know, if you've been following along on the channel, I am not the most technologically savvy booktuber out there. So I will figure out how to do a live stream, and we will do that if the channel hits 10,000 subs. So anyway, thank you so much. It's just fantastic. So let's get into Sharp Ends here. And I'm going to begin with a non-spoiler overview, kind of why you should read sort of thing. And eventually I'm going to get into some mild spoilers about the short stories themselves. And I won't, even then, I don't think I'm giving anything big away. But just if you're very sensitive to spoilers, I will warn you at the point when I'm going to start talking about the stories in a very broad way, because there's 13 of them, so I can't say a ton about them anyway. So anyway, I want to say a little bit about who should read Sharp Ends and when. I would say that you would get the most out of these short stories if you have read the original trilogy, the First Law trilogy, beginning with The Blade itself, as well as the 3 standalone novels, Best Served Cold, The Heroes, and Red Country. So I would say you would get the most out of these short stories if you have read them, because there are references to characters in those books in Sharp Ends, and some Easter eggs and minor characters who appear in here that you'll recognize, and it's just a little more fun that way. Now, a quick word about short stories versus novels. And you hear all the time that people should practice writing short stories so that they can write novels. I almost think it should be the reverse advice. People should write novels to practice writing short stories. Short stories are very hard to write well. They are very hard indeed. And Abercrombie, you would think, because he is actually, he's one of my favorite writers. If you've been following the channel, you know this. He's in my top 5 fantasy writers of all time. And he is a brilliant writer in terms of psychological insights. This is something that would serve a short story writer really well, having a good grasp of human psychology. Also, I think a short story writer would be pretty well off if they have a good sense of action and are able to pack a lot into a very short passage. And again, Joe Abercrombie definitely would sound like, I think to most of his fans, somebody who would be really good at that sort of thing. That said, I will say I enjoy these stories very much, but I think that if you just objectively take them on their own, separate them from the rest of the First Law books, they're not Joe Abercrombie's best writing. I'll just come out and say it. They're good. There's nothing terrible about them, but they are not his best writing. In fact, among all of his books, I would say that the one that I would rate the lowest might be either this, Sharp Ends, or Red Country. Red Country was my least favorite of the standalones, although in general I do like the standalones even better than the original trilogy. But Red Country, for me, was a weaker book. The Sharp Ends, also one of his weaker books, but hey, a weak Abercrombie book is better than most writers' best books, in my opinion, so not necessarily the worst thing for me to say. However, I would say that, a great novelist, Abercrombie, is great with characters, and the short story form may not be his best. he could probably get better at it. He is a craftsman who works very hard on his writing. But I think that it doesn't work as well for the development of characters that he's so known for, and probably it has most practice doing it over the course of a novel. So there are some really bright spots, though, here in Sharp Ends, and I'm going to talk about that as well. One is that there's a map of the First Law world in the beginning, and I was always complained about the lack of a map in Abercrombie's books. So, hey, here it is. I was just delighted to see this map of the First Law world in one place. Of course, I had seen it online as well, but here it is in a book. So happy me, I love maps. So I got to look at the map for quite a while there and say, oh, that's where that is, and oh, that's what that looks like. So anyway, that made me happy, at least this fan. And I would say that among all these stories, except for one very important exception, my favorites of these short stories were the Chev and Javra stories. Now, these are characters who I believe were entirely made up for these short stories, and they don't appear, in other words, in the other First Law books. These are their only appearance. There were 5 of the 13 stories are Chev and Javra stories. And I don't think it's an accident that for me, these were the best of the stories, with that one exception. These were the best of the stories because, in a way, it was almost novel-like to have these characters, Chev and Javra, a dynamic duo, appear in several of the stories. So their characters got to be developed a little bit, and it was fun to revisit them as the years pass. So not quite a novel, but I would say that those were the stories that I felt most invested in, the Chev and Javra stories. And frankly, the appearances of the familiar characters from the First Law world, they were interesting. So for a fan of First Law, they're lots of fun. You get to see characters that you love, and there's nothing wrong with that. I enjoyed that very much, seeing Glokta, a younger Glokta, and the big characters like Logan and others, and some of the minor characters too. It was fun to revisit them. But for whatever reason, I didn't feel like those stories resonated with me as much. And objectively, if I just read those stories without knowing those characters, I don't think they would be as good. There's just not as much there as there was in the Chev and Javra stories or in most of Abercrombie's other books. So those are my little tiny complaints. I still loved this book. I still highly recommend it to any First Law fans out there. You're going to love this if you haven't read it yet, and if you've enjoyed the First Law books, definitely give this a read. So I think it's time for me to talk spoilers. And again, these are very minor, very vague kinds of spoilers, but I'm just going to say a little bit about each of the short stories and to give them a sense of my impression of them. So here we go. Ready? Spoilers. The first story, A Beautiful Bastard, is a Glokta story. And this is Glokta just before he fell into the hands of the Gurkish. So this is handsome, dashing, heroic Glokta. So if you're curious at all, and an incredibly arrogant Glokta. And it's a great little story. Honestly, though, one of the weaker ones, I think, in the collection. It is interesting for the way that the perspective character is not Glokta. Actually, it's another character who'll be familiar to First Law fans. I won't say the name because it might give something away, but it's interesting to watch the psychological complexity of this character who both admires and detests this Glokta character, this dashing colonel. So interesting psychology in there. The story doesn't exactly grab me, except that I love Glokta. Who doesn't? So he's an amazing character. So it was an interesting glimpse into his past. Small Kindnesses is the next story. And this is where we initially meet Chev and Javra and where they initially meet each other. And there's another character introduced in here who is a kind of a third wheel in the Chev and Javra stories, and that is Karkalf. She is Chev's on-again, off-again love interest, and not a character that I loved. I admired Abercrombie's development of characters in general. Karkalf is an interesting character. I actually thought maybe he could have done more with Karkalf as a character. She could have done had more appearances in there, and that would have made her, I think, even more interesting. But Chev and Javra were lots of fun to meet, and you get this little glimpse into them, into their pasts and who they are in this story, Small Kindnesses. The next one, The Fool Jobs. This is one that features a familiar character, Kerndon Craw. You'll know him from The Heroes, for example. And his crew also includes Wonderful and a certain Wirren of Bly. And this is a character, I love Wirren and Wonderful, by the way. They're both wonderful characters. So you get a glimpse into their dynamic and that sort of thing. So it's a fun thing to see these familiar characters. So also there is Skipping Town. This is the next Chev and Javra short story. And this is where you really see what a badass Javra is. So Chev is kind of a diminutive thief, whereas Javra is a warrior goddess, the Lioness of Hoskop is what she called. She has lots of titles, actually. She's a fun character. They're both great characters. They're both the two most vivid characters in this collection are these two. And it's a lot of fun to see their dynamic, them butting heads, them arguing, and that sort of thing. So this was another nice look into especially Javra's past. So next one was Hell, the short story Hell. And this featured Temple. You remember Temple from Red Country, perhaps? And this is actually a younger Temple, and this is during the siege of Dagoska. Actually, it's toward the end of Dagoska, so Glokta has already, left. And you get some glimpses into the fate of the characters who were left in Dagoska. And you get a glimpse of Mamun as well. So a very interesting story for fans, I would say. And a very hectic story as well. There's some Abercrombie action in this one as well. So that makes it a little more interesting. And some tension in there. So that's handled well. The next one is Two's Company. This might be my second favorite story of the collection. My favorite is the last one, which is the only non-Chev and Javra story that I think is really brilliant. But the Two's Company, I think, is my favorite, certainly among the Chev and Javra stories. And it features, of course, the dynamic duo once again. And who do they encounter? None other than Wirren of Bly. And this is he's in two of the stories, and this is a really fun encounter. This has got Abercrombie action and, sex and lots of other things in it. So a pretty interesting story about some very pig-headed and very eccentric characters that Abercrombie just does so well. Next one is Wrong Place, Wrong Time. And this is actually a sort of a series of the little people who were stepped on in the course of the revenge taken by Mercato Monza in Best Served Cold. So, and it's a little interesting glimpse from the perspective of very tiny minor characters about what was going on during these various acts of revenge. Perhaps a little appreciation of the casualty. Maybe Abercrombie felt a little guilty about all the people she took out in the course of her vengeance. So we get a little tiny glimpse into their perspectives as they're getting, snuffed. So, so then you have Some Desperado, and this is a story about Shy, who was a character in Red Country. And not my favorite Abercrombie book, Red Country, so I was probably a little less invested in it. But it's a nice little story nevertheless. Lots of action and that sort of thing. So another one, the ninth story in there is called Yesterday Near a Village Called Barden. And this is one of those Abercrombie perspective shift kind of narratives. He does a lot of perspective shifts. This is an interesting one because it has Bremer Dan Gorst in there. And he's kind of a fun character. You'll know him from the main first trilogy. You'll know him from The Heroes, etc., etc. So there's a ton of action and humor. This was one of the funnier ones for me, actually. There are some moments in there when a particular soldier has gone into the forest to do a, nature's calling, that sort of thing, and he stumbles upon an ambush, and there's some pretty funny hijinks in there. So this was definitely one of the funnier ones. And then you have Three's a Crowd, another Chev and Javra story. And this has a little cameo of Vitari in there. You'll remember her, I'm sure, from the original trilogy. There is Karkulf, of course, and there's a lot about betrayal in this one. Lots of betrayal and the consequences of betrayal in Three's a Crowd. And then there's Freedom, and this Freedom is probably my least favorite story in the collection. It's a bit of an oddity, frankly. It is written ostensibly by Spillian Swarbreck, who you'll recognize from Red Country, the author, the famous author, who went around with one of our favorite mercenaries from the First Law world, Casca. And his job was to basically tell a bunch of lies about Casca in a book about him. So we get a little excerpt from the book. So it's a curiosity, I suppose, for First Law fans, but it is written in such a bloated, bombastic style, which of course, naturally it would be. But the thing about bloated and bombastic prose is that it reads like bloated and bombastic prose. So it is mercifully very short. So you have a little note in there by none other than Casca himself. So I suppose it's a fun little thing to throw in there. You also had the last of the Chev and Javra stories, and that is Tough Times All Over. Another one of those perspective shift stories. And you have a little more glimpse of Karkulf in there and the consequences of all the betrayals over the years and that sort of thing. So honestly, I would have loved a little more of Chev and Javra. Perhaps Abercrombie will write some more stories with them. That would be fantastic. The last story, and this one's my favorite, is Made a Monster. And this one features Bethod is the main perspective character. So this one goes back in time. These stories have all gone from the oldest, chronologically speaking, to the most recent, except for this last one goes back in time. And we see a much younger version of Logan Nine Fingers, or the Bloody Nine. And you get to understand Logan a lot better, let's just put it that way, by reading this story. So if you're a Logan Nine Fingers fan, you definitely need to read Made a Monster. This is one of the most haunting of the stories in this collection. It is. I don't want to say too much about it because I don't want to spoil it if you haven't read it, but wow, this was a powerful story, creepy, and you get to understand what Logan was running from when you meet him in the First Law books, running from himself, really. But yeah, and you also understand Bethod a lot more. He becomes, interestingly, a much more sympathetic character as a result of reading Made a Monster. So very interesting. I think this was definitely my favorite of the short stories that featured the characters who are familiar from the First Law books, and it probably is my favorite of all the short stories as well. So there you have it. There's my brief take on each of the 13 short stories in there. I am going to be doing another review very soon, another bunch of discussions I have lined up I'm really excited about. My next review is actually going to be on Richard Nell's Kings of Paradise, another grimdark book. So if you're a grimdark fan, stick around for that review in a week or less. And I've actually started reading it already, and I'm enjoying it very much. So I will be eager to talk about that one. I hope to see you in some of these discussions and reviews in the future. Until next time.